The wind howled through the frozen peaks, carrying a sound that didn't belong. Pain. Jack paused mid-step, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. At first, he dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on his ears, a deceptive whisper, weaving through the icy crags. But then it came again, a deep, guttural cry, raw and filled with agony, piercing the stillness of the wilderness. Instinct surged within him, sharp and undeniable. He adjusted the straps of his backpack, the weight settling against his shoulders, and carefully picked his way through the dense, snow-laden trees. The crunch of his boots against the frozen ground was swallowed by the wind's relentless moan. His heart thudded in his chest, a steady rhythm against the growing intensity of the sound. Each step brought it closer, louder, until it reverberated, in his bones. Finally, he broke through a cluster of pines and saw it. A massive grizzly bear lay sprawled in the snow, its front paw ensnared in the cruel, unyielding jaws of a hunting trap. Blood pooled beneath it, a stark crimson stain against the pristine white, seeping into the frost like a wound on the earth itself. But that wasn't what rooted Jack to the spot, his breath catching in his throat. A few feet away, two cubs lay, huddled together, their tiny bodies curled tightly against one another, barely rising with the shallow gasps of breath. Starving, weak, teetering on the fragile edge between life and death. The bear lifted its heavy head, its matted fur crusted with ice, and locked eyes with Jack. He braced himself for the ferocity he'd been taught to expect, a snarl, a lunge, the primal rage of a cornered animal. But there was none of that. Instead, he saw only exhaustion in its dark-ism deep brown gaze. And something else. A silent, desperate plea that reached across the gulf between man and beast. Jack's fingers trembled as he reached for the multi-tool clipped to his belt. He knew the risks all too well. One wrong move, one misstep, and those massive claws could tear through him in an instant. Yet as he inched closer, step by cautious step, the bear did something extraordinary. It didn't growl, it didn't thrash, it simply watched him, its eyes tracking his every movement with a stillness that felt almost deliberate. Taking a deep breath, Jack knelt beside the rusted trap, the cold metal biting into his knees through his thick pants. His hands, already stiff from the biting chill, worked quickly, prying at the mechanism. The wind whipped around him, tugging at his hood, stinging his exposed skin. But he pushed the discomfort aside. The trap was old, its hinges stubborn with rust and frost. He wedged the multi-tool beneath the steel jaws, leveraging his weight against it. The bear flinched as the metal groaned, a low whimper escaping its throat, but still, it didn't move. Jack's pulse raced, his muscles straining as he gave one final wrench. With a sharp, echoing snap, the trap sprang open. The bear yanked its paw free, a spray of snow and blood scattering into the air, and let out a low, rumbling breath that seemed to shake the ground beneath them. Jack stumbled backward, his boots slipping on the icy crust, expecting the attack he'd been warned about since childhood. Bears were unpredictable, dangerous, wild, but it didn't come. Instead, the bear turned its massive head toward its cubs, nudging them gently with its snout. The little ones stirred, their movements sluggish, weak, but alive, their tiny ribs visible beneath patchy fur. Jack's hands shook as he reached into his pack, pulling out a small bundle of dried meat he'd packed for the climb. He tossed it onto the snow, a few feet from the cubs. They hesitated, noses twitching, before dragging themselves toward it, nibbling at the strips with a desperate, fragile hunger. The mother bear watched him, her towering frame trembling, not from cold, he realized, but from sheer exhaustion. Then something happened that Jack never thought he'd witness, something that defied every story he'd ever heard about the wilderness. Tears welled in the bear's eyes, glistening in the pale light, a shimmer of vulnerability in a creature built for power. For a long, suspended moment, they simply stared at each other, man and bear, two souls caught in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the mountains. The wind quieted, as if the world itself held its breath. Then the bear shifted, her injured paw leaving a faint trail of red as she nudged her cubs forward. She took a step, then another, her gait unsteady but resolute, before the trio vanished into the thickening veil of the forest, swallowed by the shadows of the trees and the swirling white haze. Jack exhaled, a shaky breath that clouded the air before him, feeling the weight of the moment settle deep into his chest. He had climbed countless peaks, braved the harshest storms, faced blizzards that could bury a man alive. But nothing, not the tallest summit nor the wildest tempest, compared to what he had just experienced. In that frozen wilderness, beneath a pale winter sun, he had witnessed something beyond mere survival. He had witnessed trust, fragile and unspoken, bridging the chasm between human and animal. He remained still for a time, his gaze fixed on the spot where the bear and her cubs had disappeared. The silence pressed in around him, broken only by the distant creak of branches bending under the snow's weight. He had come to these peaks seeking solitude, an escape from the clamor and chaos of civilization. He'd wanted the quiet, the simplicity of nature's indifference. But in this raw, unscripted encounter, he had found something far greater than he'd ever expected. A connection, a fleeting glimpse into the heart of the wild. Slowly, he knelt beside the trap, its jagged teeth now splayed open like a defeated beast of its own. He ran his fingers over the rusted surface, tracing the cruel edges that had bitten into flesh and bone. A pang of anger flared in his chest, sharp and hot, mingling with a quieter, heavier sadness. Someone had set this, knowing full well the suffering it could inflict. He'd crossed paths with hunters before, men who took life without thought, without reverence, their rifles slung over their shoulders like trophies. Jack wasn't naive. He understood survival, the brutal necessity of it in places like this. But this trap, abandoned and merciless, wasn't about survival. It was about cruelty, plain and cold. He clenched his jaw, making a silent vow to himself. If he ever stumbled across another trap like this, he would dismantle it, piece by rusted piece, until the mountains were rid of them. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the towering peaks, casting long shadows across the snow and painting the sky in shades of amber and violet. The temperature was dropping fast, the air growing sharper with every passing minute. Jack sighed, adjusting his pack once more, the straps digging into his shoulders. His fingers were still numb, his breath still visible in fleeting clouds, but there was a strange warmth blooming inside him now, steady and unshakable. He had saved a life today, maybe 3, and as he turned back toward his trail, boots crunching softly against the snow, he realized something profound. In that fleeting, frozen moment, the wild had spoken to him. For the first time in all his years of wandering, he truly understood its voice. A language not of words, but of presence, of trust, of life enduring against all odds. He paused once more, glancing back at the tracks fading into the distance, the bear's uneven prints flanked by the smaller, faltering steps of her cubs. The mountains stretched endlessly before him, their jagged silhouettes etched against the dying light. He didn't know if the cubs would survive the night or if the mother's strength would hold long enough to see them through. But he'd given them a chance, a sliver of hope in a world that offered so little, and somehow that was enough. With a final nod to the wilderness, he turned and pressed onward, carrying the weight of that encounter like a quiet flame in his chest, guiding him through the gathering dusk.